14 Transportation HUD Appropriations Bill. Later in this debate, I'll discuss the equally disastrous cuts in community development block grants. It's just another example of how this bill is dismantling the United States. I thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
I rise to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I come to address the House, the Congress of the United States. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We're the most powerful country in the world. We have one program that focuses on improving the life and life chances of people in our lower income communities across our country. It's called the Community Development Block Grant. It was created under a Republican president, Richard Nixon, in 1974. Since its inception, we've invested about $132 billion in some 1,209 communities across our country. Now, this is over the life of this program, we've invested about the same amount as we took to build the International Space Station. We spent approximately the same amount 1 year in Afghanistan. This year we're spending $3.3 billion on the Community Development Block Grant. It is the lowest amount in the history of our nation, and what the majority, my friends on the other side, are proposing in this appropriations bill is that rather than spend the least amount ever on this effort, at 3.3, they want to slash it to 1.6. Now, it's not that they are mean-spirited. It is because the allocation for this bill is fatally deficient. It's too low to meet the needs of the greatest country on earth in so many respects. We could be here all day pointing out the deficiencies. But I want to just focus in on this one program because it was created by a Republican president. It operates in the most, I think, approving way for those on the other team. That is to say, these are grants in which all of the decisions are made at the local level by Republican and Democratic governors, by Republican and Democratic local officials. They decide what the priority is going to be to help uplift these communities. So it's unfortunate that they would single out this particular program, the only program that we have to help the neediest communities across our country. I've seen its work in local business districts encouraging small business development. I've seen its work in helping seniors put in major systems repair and heating and windows or roofing so that they can be protected in the winter. This is a great program. Even though it was developed by a president of the other party, it operates through local decision-making. It's already at the lowest level ever. And if you added up what we've invested in it in all of these years, it wouldn't add up to what we spent building the International Space Station. If we added up all that we spent on it all of these years, it barely gets to the number we spent in 1 year in Afghanistan. But we still think somehow we should cut it in half. It's a wrong-headed decision. I'd ask that we reconsider it. I know the allocation is tough, but it's going to be a lot tougher on so many more Americans who live in communities reminded of what Jay-Z says, that they have their shades on just waiting on the sun to shine their way. I'd ask my colleagues to think about that as we go forward. Think about the wrong-headedness of this and how unworthy it is for the greatest country on earth to say to citizens who need our help that somehow we can spend in Afghanistan in some far-off place, or we can build a great International Space Station, which I support, but somehow we can't do anything about the challenges in these neighborhoods. I yield back the balance of my time. I ask that the entire House that we live up to our responsibilities in a much different way than we're doing now. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Griffin of Arkansas, page 2, line 13, after the first dollar amount, insert reduced by $500,000 Page 56, line 25, after the first dollar amount, insert increased by $500,000.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On March 29, 2013, the ExxonMobil Pegasus pipeline in Mayflower, Arkansas, spilled thousands of gallons of oil to the homes and properties surrounding the ruptured pipelines. I'm committed to making things right for the people of Mayflower and ensuring that another spill like this doesn't occur again in Arkansas. The U.S. Department of Transportation Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, is responsible for regulating and ensuring the safe and secure movement of oil and petroleum products to industry and consumers through our nation's interstate pipelines. As an interstate pipeline, inspection of the Pegasus pipeline was PHMSA's responsibility. Pipelines move nearly two-thirds of the oil and petroleum products transported annually. Interstate pipelines deliver over 11.3 billion barrels of petroleum each year. The cost to transport a barrel of petroleum products from Houston to the New York harbor is about $1. American pipelines are indisputably the safest way to move oil, and I remain supportive of the pipeline infrastructure that will provide important jobs and energy to Americans. But we've got to make sure these pipelines are safe. Every year, pipelines transport more than 11 billion barrels of oil, and last year, less than 0.5% of it was lost to spills. But we've got to do what we can to make sure the spills that did occur don't happen. Although the amount of spills is a minimal fraction of what we safely transport throughout the country, I know we can still make more certain the safety of our nation's pipelines. I continue to support the safe transport of our nation's oil and petroleum products and have introduced my amendment to increase the budget for PHMSA's operational expenses by $500,000 to further ensure the safety of our nation's pipelines. This appropriation finances the operational support costs for PHMSA, including agency-wide functions of administration, management, policy development, legal counsel, budget financial management, civil rights, human resources, acquisition services, information technology, and governmental and public affairs. I ask that you support, the House support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise?
Mr. Chairman, I would rise in support of the amendment. I think it's very well thought out. He does have it offset, and so the committee position on this side would be to support the amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arkansas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fattah, who talked about the underfunding of so many important programs in this bill, but in particular the Community Development Block Grant program. You know, when we talk about our national security, it means more than the number of missiles that we possess, and it means more than the number of military bases we have overseas. It means as well, and just as importantly, many of the priorities that are contained in the Transportation and Housing and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. And that is why it pains me to come to the floor today to lament about how woefully underfunded key transportation, infrastructure, and housing programs are in this bill. Programs that revitalize our communities, help our neighbors secure affordable housing, and support smart economic development. The bill, as it is before us today, simply put, is unfixable at its current allocation level. There are programs like the Home Program, which is at the lowest funding level in its history. Just so my colleagues understand, the Home Program is a critical federal investment utilized by states and localities to provide affordable rental and home ownership opportunities for low-income households. As we recover from a damaging recession, these cuts in this program will put further strain on affordable housing opportunities. This bill also severely underfunds tenant-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance, and the Public Housing Capital Fund. You know, I continue to hear from housing advocates in my home state of Massachusetts, and their message is consistent and clear. We need more funding in these accounts to ensure that all families have access to affordable, comfortable, and stable housing. The families that we're talking about aren't losing sleep overnight wondering whether they're going to be attacked from some country overseas. They're losing sleep overnight because they don't know whether they're going to have shelter to protect their own families. They're worried about their own security in this country, and yet we are underfunding these programs so significantly. But I'm especially concerned, as my colleague from Pennsylvania stated, about the proposed reduction in community development block grant funding. This bill cuts CDBG formula grants by nearly 50%, and funds this program at its lowest level since its creation in the 1970s. Now, in April, I joined with 143 bipartisan members on a programmatic request letter to appropriators in support of $3.3 billion for this program. In July, after the subcommittee's legislation was released, 101 bipartisan members wrote to the Appropriations Committee again, expressing support for effective funding levels. There is demonstrated bipartisan support for community development block grants, Mr. Speaker, because these dollars are at work in communities in each of our districts. Last week, Governor Deval Patrick of Massachusetts announced that 38 communities in Massachusetts will receive over $31 million in CDBG funding. These dollars will fund housing rehabilitation, child care centers, cityscape improvements, and social services, just to name a few. I also want to point out that every $1 in community development block grants leverages an additional $3.55 in funding to revitalize our communities. Investing these federal dollars in our cities and in our towns spurs redevelopment efforts and provides a high return on our investment. These funds also create and save jobs. Since FY 2005, these funds have created or retained over 300,000 jobs. If my friends on the other side of the aisle are serious about job creation, CDBG is not the place to cut. Now, realizing the need for effective funding, the Senate Appropriations Bill funds the program at $3.15 billion. So should this bill go to conference, Mr. Speaker, I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reject these cuts in the House bill and support robust funding for community development block grants, a program with a proven record of supporting community development efforts across our country. Let's stop these reckless and harmful cuts to our communities. We ought to be on the floor today fixing sequestration. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle should be on the floor today appointing conferees on the budget so that we can negotiate more reasonable allocations on these appropriations bills. I would remind my colleagues that this is not some abstract debate that we are having here today on the floor. These cuts will hurt real people. They will pave the way for more deterioration of our cities and towns. They will cost jobs, and they will hurt our economy. Enough is enough. We're supposed to be helping people, not hurting people, and it's time for Congress to get its priorities straight. I urge my colleagues to support the CDBG program. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise? Oh, Texas.
Move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise to enter into a colloquy with my colleague, Mr. Latham, the distinguished chairman of the subcommittee.
I would be happy to enter into the colloquy with the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I know that you know that our nation continues to suffer from a debt crisis which is spending-driven, and the only real remedy is to quit spending money that we don't have. But regrettably, the President would not work with us to enact meaningful, targeted spending discipline, so his sequester has been enacted. Mr. Chairman, we are the stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, and with the President's sequester in place, I believe it is now more critical than ever that our nation's transportation funding be spent wisely, including funding for the FAA's contract tower program. Because, Mr. Chairman, it's not, in Washington, it's not always how much money you spend that counts, it's how you spend the money. I would simply ask the distinguished chairman to work with me and other members to ensure that this critical funding is allocated to the facilities that represent the greatest cost benefit to the taxpayer.
I appreciate the gentleman's attention to this issue. I look forward to working with him and the FAA to ensure that our limited federal dollars go to towers that provide the greatest benefit to the taxpayer.
I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the requisite words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 2610. This bill, which was crafted to conform to the strangling and senseless limits of the Ryan budget, would cut the total discretionary funding for the transportation HUD appropriations measure by $7.7 billion below that enacted fiscal year 2013 appropriation, and by more than $4 billion below the level of funding provided after sequestration took effect. These cuts would devastate programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Home Program, which are essential to supporting development in cities throughout our nation and to providing housing and other services to our most vulnerable citizens. This bill would also be devastating to our national passenger rail service, Amtrak, and that is the specific issue I will address today. The bill before us would cut the capital grant provided to Amtrak by some $352 million and cut the operating grant by $119 million below the enacted fiscal year 2013 levels. Such cuts would likely force Amtrak to reduce its maintenance levels and furlough maintenance personnel. Such cuts may even lead to reduced service on the Northeast Corridor, the critical link on the eastern seaboard among Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. In their views on the Transportation HUD appropriations measure, the minority noted that this bill is out of touch with reality, and that it is nowhere more evident than in the proposed funding level for Amtrak. While the House majority has undertaken a relentless effort to destroy Amtrak, the traveling public has made it clear they consider Amtrak to be an essential part of our nation's transportation network. Amtrak finished fiscal year 2012 having carried more than 31 million passengers, the highest number of passengers in any year since Amtrak was created. This total included more than 11 million passengers who traveled on the Northeast Corridor. Together, the long-distance routes had their highest passenger volumes in 19 years, and Amtrak set 12 consecutive monthly ridership records during fiscal year 2012. To put this number in perspective, if Amtrak were an airline, it would be the 6th largest in the country. Americans have voted with their ticket purchases, and they are choosing to ride Amtrak in greater numbers. In fact, record ridership growth is continuing in fiscal year 2013. Rather than seeking to destroy a service critical to our nation's mobility, we should be investing in this system to ensure it can continue to meet increased passenger demand with increased speed and efficiency. Significant infrastructure improvements are needed all along the Northeast Corridor to create truly high-speed rail service. In Maryland, for example, the BNP Tunnel, which carries every train traveling into Washington, D.C. from all points north of the city, must be replaced. This tunnel was opened in 1873, and its antiquated design limits train speeds to 30 miles per hour. We would not think of relying on technology from the 1870s in other aspects of our lives. We wouldn't want medical technology or communications technology from the 1870s, and we should not be content to rely on transportation infrastructure from the 1870s. The President has rightly threatened to veto this bill, and rather than waste the House's time on legislation like this that threatens to degrade our transportation networks and delay passengers and commerce, we should be considering bills that will make long overdue investments to expand our mobility and support our economic growth. Rather than cutting investments in Amtrak, we should be investing in the development of truly high-speed rail on the Northeast Corridor and throughout these United States. And before we consider this or any other appropriations measures, the House and Senate should follow regular order by appointing conferees who can resolve a budget that can be adopted by both bodies and that can then guide the development of appropriations measures for fiscal year 2014. I urge members to oppose this misguided legislation, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, here we go again. This transportation, housing, and urban development bill before us today is the latest in a long series of appropriations bills from the House majority that grossly underfunds the fundamental priorities of American families. Every time we see a new appropriations bill come from this majority, the vital national needs that are meant to be covered in that legislation have been cut to the bone. In this case, this bill makes deep cuts in everything from the upkeep of air traffic control systems to Amtrak to community development, block grants, and home grants. This bill endangers our infrastructure, our public safety, and our communities. It is yet another example of the problems created by the majority's obsessive fixation on slashing all non-defense spending programs, to the detriment of the priorities we were elected to uphold. Let's step back for a moment. Look at the big picture. The Budget Control Act of 2011 placed strict limits on appropriations. Defense and non-defense domestic programs that are scheduled to remain in place through 2021. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated that these caps will reduce spending by a total of $840 billion over 10 years, compared to the policies previously in place. Now, on top of these Budget Control Act caps, we also have the deep and indiscriminate across-the-board cuts caused by sequestration. Despite claims to the contrary by this majority, the effects of the sequester cuts are real. They're real and they are damaging. We are talking about children losing access to Head Start and the opportunities for their growth and development that early childhood education provides. Low-income women will lose access to the cancer screenings that could save their lives. Seniors will be hungry because Meals on Wheels distribution has been pared back. When the new school year starts in September, school districts already struggling to make ends meet will face an additional across-the-board 5% cut in federal aid. And in terms of medical research, the National Institutes of Health will be supporting the smallest number of research project grants this year in more than a decade. These cuts will have profound and lasting consequences for families, for students, for the pace of scientific research. But despite that, the majority apparently thinks that the problem with sequestration, at least when it comes to domestic spending, is that the cuts were too small. They have been assembling a series of bills for 2014 that cut the resources for non-defense programs by a total of almost $47 billion below the 2013 post-sequester level. That is not the right direction for this country. That's not what we ought to be doing. In total, the majority's 2014 budget bills will bring funding for non-defense appropriations to their lowest level on record as a share of GDP, with records on this basis going back to 1976. In other words, the majority proposes to spend less relative to the economy on things like infrastructure, scientific research, education, environmental protection, the key investments that grow our economy, than at any time in nearly the last 40 years. Within the total, some bills are targeted for larger cuts than others. Sequestration has already cut transportation, housing, infrastructure programs that are covered in today's bill by more than $3 billion. This legislation would slash another $4.4 billion. That's bad enough. But the largest cuts of all come in the Labor, Health and Human Services Education Bill, which the majority seems to consider the very lowest priority. The allocation to that bill starts with this year's $7 billion in sequestration cuts and then cuts $28 billion more. Think about it for a moment. For programs like education, medical research, job training, public health, the majority does not just want to double down on sequestration, they want to quadruple down. This is not about saving money or reducing the deficit. This is about ideology, pure and simple. The majority's approach is not required by the Budget Control Act. On the contrary, in total, their bills are $47.7 billion below the Budget Control Act cap on non-defense spending, and that is the cap with sequestration in place. Because this bill is already far leaner than even the BCA and the sequestration required, there are no offsets to be had to ameliorate the deep and dangerous cuts to community development block grants, housing, Amtrak, mass transit.
Gentlewoman's time has
expired. The bottom line is that the majority is very explicitly trying to underfund the priorities in this legislation. They have put forward a budget that sets our government and our nation up to fail. This is not the right choice for America, for our kids or our future. Responsible budgeting means making key investments that grow the economy and improve America's families' quality of life. It is not responsibility budget. I urge defeat of this grossly inadequate bill, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join my colleagues in strong support of the Community Development Block Grant and the tremendous benefits that this program has afforded millions of low and moderate income Americans since its inception in 1974 under Republican leadership. The Community Development Block Grant is a vital tool that the Department of Housing and Urban Development uses to provide for new developments and affordable housing in local communities all across the country. The fiscal year 2014 House Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Appropriations Bill indiscriminately slashes the grants by almost half, or $1.6 billion less than the current $3.3 billion for the fiscal year 2013. These cuts do not reflect a change in need or have any basis in reality, and they would do incredible harm to local communities across the entire nation. The House version of this bill is simply unworkable in its current form, and it plainly ignores many of the benefits that the CDBG program provides for 1,209 state and local governments that receive these grants since 1974. CDBG has invested over $135 billion in local economies. Even further, every dollar that's been invested leverages an additional $3.55 in non-CDBG funding, which can go toward improving existing infrastructure, new jobs, and housing repair, as well as home ownership assistance. By slashing these funding, the House majority will invariably bring them to countless low and moderate income Americans countless destruction. I'm not prepared to do that, and neither are many of us, even many Republican colleagues. Cuts from years prior have always had devastating consequences. The city of Dallas, for example, is considering another round of cuts or eliminating certain programs entirely in light of projected budget reductions. For Dallas, it could mean eliminating grants for affordable housing, developing, shrinking the mortgage assistance program, decimating new home construction in areas targeted by the revitalization. Mr. Speaker, the fiscal year 2014 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations will bring considerable harm, and we're considering it this week as just another example of the misguided policies of the current Republican majority. As long as my current majority Republicans refuse to work together with the House Democrats to develop a sensible budget framework, the American people will continue to suffer the consequences of draconian cuts to invaluable social programs. When we shut down everything, it does not help us economically. It shuts us down. It moves us backwards. There is a right way and a wrong way, and we cannot continue to do it the way this current Republican majority is pushing. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to join my colleagues today in advocating for critical investments to rebuild our nation's transportation infrastructure. The bill we're considering this week makes devastating cuts that will have serious consequences on our ability to compete in the global economy and assure the stability and well-being of local communities. The fact of the matter is that our infrastructure is crumbling, with the American Society of Civil Engineers grading the United States with a D+ on their annual report card assessing the condition of America's infrastructure. In my home state of Rhode Island, 21% of our 757 bridges are structurally deficient and in need of repairs. In the short term, supporting our nation's roads, rails, and airports will generate job growth in a construction sector that remains hard hit from this recession, employing the talented, capable men and women of the building trades to rebuild America. In a rapidly changing global economy, the ability to quickly and safely transport goods, services, and information is a real advantage. To compete successfully, every American business, from energy companies and manufacturers to technology companies and farmers, must have access to a world-class connected transportation system. But to maintain this edge, virtually every expert has said we must continue to invest in rebuilding America. If you don't believe me, look at the strategic decisions being made by competing nations. Just last week, China's Ministry of Rails announced plans to invest another $32 billion to upgrade their rail system. In June, President Putin proposed investing $43 billion to build a new superhighway in Moscow, modernize the Trans-Siberian Railway, and construct a brand-new 500-mile high-speed rail line. While Russia and China are betting on their economic future, my friends on the other side of the aisle have offered a bill that would unquestionably set us back. This bill guts investments in our railroads, cutting more than $468 million in funding for Amtrak compared to fiscal year 2013 enacted levels, and eliminates all funding for high-speed rail. This bill cuts intercity passenger rail, despite recent reports demonstrating how rail has been an area of growth. According to a report from the Brookings Institute, last year Amtrak was our nation's fastest-growing mode of transportation in the last 15 years. My local train station in Providence, Rhode Island, has seen ridership totals increase by more than 137%, and Amtrak is not just used by tourists. So demand for intercity passenger rail service has grown exponentially in the last decade, and our competitors abroad had noticed, investing billions in their rail systems. But here, some of my colleagues have decided to slash funding and put our rail system at risk. This is clearly the wrong approach. Of course, this legislation does not only jeopardize our nation's rail system, it also slashes funding for municipal and state governments hoping to invest in critical local projects. This bill eliminates all funding for the Tiger Grant Program in fiscal year 2014, and it rescinds $237 million of the $500 million appropriated for the current fiscal year. The Tiger Program invests in innovative, multimodal transportation projects, providing for upgrades of bridges, roads, ports, and other transportation infrastructure that are critical to regional economies. Perhaps most importantly, this is a program that encourages local stakeholders to plan for their future and think about innovations to local transportation infrastructure that will spur growth and create jobs. This is exactly how federal investments are supposed to work. Unfortunately, this bill once again leaves our state and local partners without the resources needed to help strengthen local communities. Sadly, it gets worse. This bill also jeopardizes the still fragile recovery of our housing market and communities at risk. For example, this bill decimates funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which was signed into law by a Republican president who recognized the importance of assisting communities by providing flexibility to invest in everything from wastewater treatment facilities to housing and economic development. This critical program is a lifeline for families facing difficult economic challenges and provides critical resources to promote economic development and improve quality of life. Today, this bill cuts CDBG funding levels almost in half compared to current enacted levels, the lowest level of funding since it began, and $1 billion less than President Ford requested for the program in 1975. Let that sink in. This bill cuts our investments in local projects so drastically that we've reduced programs to less than 60% of what they were nearly 4 decades ago. Mr. Chairman, this bill clearly does not reflect our values and priorities as a nation. I urge my colleagues to reject this reckless and short-sighted bill and work together on a plan to respond to our urgent transportation and infrastructure needs, and a plan that dedicates resources to strengthening local communities. Our ability to promote growth, create jobs, and compete in a global economy depends on it. I thank the gentleman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I am in strong opposition of the underlying bill as it makes damaging cuts to community development block grants. A cut of $1.6 billion, a nearly 50% reduction from the previous year, is not smart policymaking. These draconian cuts will no doubt have lasting harmful effects on our communities throughout the country. Since 1974, over 1,200 communities relied on CDBG funds to support development projects and make other important improvements. These funds are used in providing social services for the poor and senior citizens, improving dilapidated housing facilities, supporting local food banks, and maintaining local parks. CDBG funds are critical investments made by the federal government to bring important benefits to local communities. My district, for example, stands to lose almost $2.2 million next year if these cuts go into effect. That's nearly half of what they got last year. And it's on top of hundreds of thousands of cities in my district that have already lost due to the poorly designed automatic cuts known as sequestration. The city of Pasadena will see their funding drop from $1.7 million to under $1 million. The city of Alhambra will see their funding drop from around $800,000 down to only $430,000. These cuts are more than lines on a piece of paper. They will have real impacts on my neighbors and my community. Take People for People, a food bank run by the West San Gabriel Valley Church Council for the last 25 years. People to People provides the homeless and needy families with clothes and boxes of food. During the recession, they saw a 20% spike in the numbers of families who came to them for help. Last year, they were able to support hundreds of millions of people, the hundreds of millions that are suffering right now, and hundreds of families stay afloat with local donations and a $27,000 grant through CDBG. But this year, because of federal government cuts, they will receive 75% less, merely $7,000. But People for People isn't the only program that will get hit. Countless other nonprofit service organizations around the San Gabriel Valley will be forced to serve fewer low-income residents at a time when they need it the most. CDBG funds have helped fund tutoring, health services, small business assistance, senior services, food assistance, and fair housing services. Cities will have to cut back on home rehabilitation programs that improve blighted neighborhoods and public facilities, improvements that make cities safer and more accessible. And fewer construction projects means fewer construction jobs, too. During this time of economic recovery, we cannot pull out the rug from programs that are vital to helping our constituents. Our cities, our communities, and our constituents cannot afford these drastic cuts to CDBG funding. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this terrible bill.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker and my colleagues. I rise today because our Transportation HUD Appropriations Act is insufficient to maintain our national transportation infrastructure and invest properly in community development and safe, affordable housing. These Transportation HUD Appropriation Act, it really guts investments critical to strong, sustainable communities. and in particular, it decimates the Community Development Block Grants program, slashing it in half to the lowest level the program began in 1975. This isn't just something that hurts Democrats. It hurts Republicans. It hurts everybody. It's across the board. And so for the Community Development Program to work and ensure access to decent, affordable housing, to provide services to the most vulnerable in our communities, and to create jobs through the expansion and retention of businesses, we've got to reject this proposal before us. Communities across the country rely on the Community Development Block Grant to provide critical services for low-income people and their families, as well as economic development assistance to small businesses and infrastructure improvements. To this day, the Community Development Block Grant remains the principal source of revenue for localities to use in devising flexible solutions to prevent economic and social deterioration in lower-income neighborhoods and communities throughout the nation. These grants are an important tool for helping local governments tackle serious challenges facing their communities, making a difference in the lives of millions of people and their communities across the nation. Now, Detroit is a long-standing Community Development Block Grant grantee, receiving on an average of $33 million in annual funding, while Wayne County, which Detroit is in, receives an additional $5.3 million. Yet this proposal in the appropriations bill would drastically cut these funds. And the CDBG program in Detroit and Wayne County includes preserving low and moderate income neighborhoods, offering a range of housing choices, constructing urban infrastructure, improving the appearance of urban and rural communities, increasing the quality of neighborhood-based living, and decreasing negative environmental impacts. And so, for my conservative friends to continue to focus solely on reducing the deficit, in particular doing so on the backs of the most vulnerable Americans, is unnecessary and not appreciated. Although deficit reduction is an important task, Congress can't balance the budget on the backs of working families, and sharply reducing programs like the Community Development Block Grant and Home is going the wrong direction. What I would say, this is the second major cut for the Community Development Block Grant funding since the Great Recession. The CDBG coalition, consisting of national organizations representing local elected officials, state and local government practitioners, development organizations, and nonprofit organizations, all strongly oppose these cuts. These are individuals working daily in their communities with the most acute awareness of what their communities need in support of them and our constituents. And so in support of them and our constituents, we must fund CDBG formula grants at no less than the $3.3 billion in FY14. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, I ask the Congress
the gentleman's time has expired.
To stop trying to balance the budget on the backs of working families. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise? Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the appropriation process, over 100 members and I expressed our concern about the low funding level for community development block grants. These grants are one of the most successful, cost-effective federal programs that encourage economic growth in our cities and communities across the country. According to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, for every $100 of CDBG investment leads to an additional $3.55 of investment from outside sources. In California's 35th Congressional District, the cities of Pomona, Chino, Ontario, Fontana, and Rialto, where people of all parties reside, currently receive community development block grant funding. This funding is used to build affordable housing, construct sidewalks, and invest in energy efficiency, water conservation, gang prevention, and after-school programs. These programs maintain strong neighborhoods and promote a higher quality of life for residents in the district. With the proposed cuts in this bill, it is estimated that they will lose 50% of funding for next year. I strongly oppose these devastating cuts. I ask that other members consider their communities and oppose these cuts too. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Let me start with the fact that I choose to believe that Mr. Latham does not like this bill. Mr. Latham is not listening to me. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to say that I start my debate that I choose to believe that you do not like this bill. I know you. I've worked with you over a long period of time. This bill is insufficient to meet the obligations of this subcommittee. It is unworthy of the support of this House. Mr. Chairman, there are many things wrong with the 2014 Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriation Bill, but perhaps none more egregious than its severely painful cuts to the community development block grants. Now let me start with this observation. This is not about a poor people's program. It helps some poor people, but it helps communities, rich, moderate, and poor. This is not about the 47%. This is about the 100%. The Community Development Block Grant Program was enacted on a bipartisan basis in 1974 and signed into law by the President, Gerald Ford, former minority leader of this House, President of the United States. From its beginning, it has served as a model of how bipartisan compromise in Congress can help tackle important challenges on the local level. For nearly 40 years, these grants have been awarded on a formula basis to state and local governments for infrastructure development, the creation and maintenance of affordable housing units, and anti-poverty initiatives. It makes communities better. It empowers members of Congress to be able to help their local communities who elect them. These grants save lives in our largest cities and in our smallest towns, in Alaska, in Hawaii, and in Maryland. The cuts in this bill would reduce community development block grant by more than half. America is not bankrupt. America need not claim defeat and retreat. America has the resources, if it has the will, to grow our economies, to grow our communities, and to make them better. We appropriated around $3.8 billion for these grants in fiscal year 2012, while this bill would cut that figure by just $1.6 billion. To put this into perspective, in 2001, we spent $4.7 billion under George Bush II on community development block grants. After years of whittling away at those critical grants, which empower our states, counties, and cities to help the most vulnerable have a chance at finding jobs and putting roofs over their heads, it would be devastating to communities whose budgets are already pushed to the limit and rely on these grants to serve their residents, all of their residents. Our friends on the other side of the aisle talk a great deal about fiscal
responsibility. But what about social responsibility? Now, I'm a strong proponent of fiscal responsibility. But if fiscal responsibility is not coupled with social responsibility, it is not worthy of this House or this country. Community development block grants are an instrument of our common citizenship and, yes, our common humanity. And in this case, however, they are a poignant example of Republican strategy of disinvestment in America and abandonment of our communities and their people. Surely we're better than that, Mr. Chairman. When we considered Veterans Affairs, military construction, and defense appropriations bills that included robust funding, we knew those funds had to come from somewhere. Here it comes. Like our Republican friends, we believe we must invest in a strong national defense, as Chairwoman Mikulski has been doing on the Senate Appropriations Committee. But we do not share the Republican majority's view that we ought to abandon our domestic priorities in the process. We're better than that. And none of us are surprised that their strategy to deal with the sequester is to ignore its consequences and impose cuts even deeper than the sequester calls for. In fact, I know of a number of our colleagues on the Republican side who see the folly in such strategy, but cannot or will not speak up for fear of the political consequences from the radical right. This bill is proof that such a strategy is underway. It's not only an abdication of responsible leadership, it is a recipe for gridlock, as Democrats in the House and Senate could never agree to it. Reject this bill. We can and must do better.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this is a slash and burn budget. I don't know why we bother. Whether you're looking at the community block grant or the section, I'm going to say a few words about the Amtrak section. You know, we're supposed to reauthorize a highway bill this year, a railway bill this year. That certainly won't matter if the Transportation and HUD Appropriations bill simply ignores authorized infrastructure spending and building. We have Amtrak because the private sector insisted that we take it. They proved that you can't run a railroad without public subsidy. Amtrak has done an amazing job considering how little public subsidy it has gotten. The private sector gave it to us because they couldn't handle the operating expenses and they couldn't handle the capital expenses. Now, Amtrak, by the ticket, is basically handling the operating expenses. Shame on us that we will not come forward to do our part with the capital expenses, with a 37% cut in capital expenses. That is the way, Mr. Speaker, to run a railroad into the ground that otherwise is doing very well on its own dime. 35% difference between these two bills. Republican bill is bipartisan. We're about to pass a bill here that nobody would consider in the Senate and that the President would have to veto. Why are we going through these appropriation exercises that amount to nothing? Amtrak is more than sustaining itself. Virtually each month this year, it has had record ridership. Amtrak actually recovers almost 80% of its operating costs out of ticket revenue. That's amazing right there. Seems to me Amtrak ought to be rewarded rather than, as this bill does, punished. Amtrak carries 31 million passengers every year, and it keeps increasing. People are preferring rail. 20,000 people depend on Amtrak for their jobs all over America. 47 states. Yeah, we know about it here on the in the East. 46 states. 1 million daily commuters. This is our national railroad. Unbelievable that we would be content to see every single nation in the world that considers itself an advanced nation generations ahead of us on railroad. We are 2 generations behind, for example, on high speed, and there is $0 in this bill for high-speed railroad. Amtrak is very well managed. In the committee, we have heard what they have done and how they have done it, but they can't manage without at least some recognition from the Congress that we too have a role to play in a railroad. No railroad in the world is unsubsidized. This one is subsidized very little. It is still able to run most of its trains over 100 miles an hour. And we ought to understand who we're talking about. We're not just talking about the District of Columbia to New York. Of the 25 busiest stations, Amtrak stations, what about Seattle or Harrisburg or Bakersfield, California? At a time when the airlines are in trouble and have reduced their operations, and Amtrak keeps growing in ridership each and every month, we have a winning operation here. We are sending it back into losing for us. We don't need to do that. We have a railroad that offers middle-class jobs to 20,000 people, 2 of them in the District of Columbia. Let's do what we need to do in the THUD bill.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Gallego of Texas. Page 3, line 5, strike not to exceed.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is a very simple amendment. It simply strikes 3 words, not to exceed, with respect to the budget of an office that I consider to be pretty important, and that is the Intelligence, Security, and Emergency Response. As you look through the bill, every single part of the Office of the Secretary has a separate line item. And in looking at the bill, I noticed, for example, that for emergency response and security, we have budgeted a little over $10 million. But on the other hand, we have budgeted about twice as much for the lawyers, for the Office of General Counsel. The lawyers somehow get twice as much as emergency response and security. And frankly, as I look at the list and how the money is divided, we spend $24 million roughly, so nearly more than 2 times as much for the Assistant Secretary for Policy. All of that more important than security. And for me, as a member of Congress who represents some 59,000 square miles, including 5 ports of entry, 800 miles of the Texas border with Mexico, an area, frankly, where we have seen emergencies before, we have seen emergency response before, we have had several instances, and frankly, the Congress is consistently and rightfully concerned with security. It seems to me that we would give the Department of Transportation some additional flexibility. This doesn't raise, per se, their amount of money that's available to them. What it does is give them additional flexibility so that in the event they don't spend the line items from the other items, if they don't spend the money from the Office of Public Affairs or the Office of Government Affairs or the Office of General Counsel. It gives them the ability, the flexibility to spend more money for intelligence, security, and emergency response. And I think if you ask every single individual member of Congress what's more important, the lawyers at the Department of Transportation or emergency response, what's more important, the lawyers at the Department of Transportation or the Office of Security? All of these kinds of things, especially for a member from the border, I think are more important. And again, it doesn't cost any more money. It doesn't appropriate any more money per se. What it does is it gives the agency the ability to move money around, the flexibility to provide additional money should it become necessary. And frankly, one never knows what kind of emergency is going to come up. One never knows what's going to happen, whether it's going to be a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. And it always pays to have the emergency response folks have the level of flexibility that they need in order to understand that regardless of what happens, they have the opportunity to do their jobs and to do their jobs well. Additional budget flexibility in times of limited dollars and limited budgets, additional flexibility, I think, is very key. And so what this amendment would propose to do is simply strike those three words, not to exceed, so that there would potentially be an opportunity for the Department of Transportation to spend more money on emergency response and security than the $10 million that's allotted for them, or the little over $10 million that's allotted to them for the whole year. And Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa rise?